1, 2. Is this on? Welcome to another answer to the age-old question of, do you know what really burns my ass? When game companies go out of their way to be different for difference's sake. Back in 1993, FASA produced the tabletop role-playing game Earthdawn. This was a fantasy game that served as a spiritual sequel and literal prequel to their already popular game Shadowrun. Fun fact, Shadowrun as a game trademarked the term Matrix a decade before the Keanu Reeves movie of the same name. Earthdawn continued the concept of magic returning to the world that Shadowrun was built on. In Shadowrun, you play mercenaries and other types of characters in a near-futuristic setting where magic has returned to the world, so tech is more advanced and exists alongside mages and elves and dwarves, etc. Shadowrun is a D6 dice pool game. This means that die rolls for success or failure requires a handful of six-sided dice. Each die in the pool can either succeed or fail on its own, and total success or failure is determined by how many dice succeed. Shadowrun was one of the first games to use a dice pool system. It came out in 1989, but two other less popular games had come out from other companies in the previous 2 years using the same general mechanic. I do think it is arguable that Shadowrun was the game that made this mechanic popular, and I feel it was a misstep that Earthdawn separated from this mechanic and went for more Dungeons & Dragons feel. Earthdawn used the same multi-sided dice that Dungeons & Dragons uses. I feel they chose this because, being a fantasy game in the early 90s, it was expected. But they used those dice in wildly different ways that were so much less effective or easy to understand. At the time, Dungeons & Dragons was in its second edition as Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. The basic mechanic was to roll a 20-sided die, add modifiers, and then compare to a chart called Theta, or 2-hit armor class 0. The secondary mechanic was to roll a 20-sided die and compare it to a chart to see if you succeed at a skill or avoid a hazard. From there, percentiles were used for certain thief abilities, and other shapes were used for different forms of damage dealt. Earthdawn instead had a set of steps that a character's skill or ability was set at. This step determined what dice were rolled. As in Shadowrun, dice that rolled their maximum value exploded and were rolled again and added together. So someone with a step 5 rolled an 8-sided die, while someone with a step 14 rolled a 20-sided and a 4-sided and then added them together. Eventually, Earthdawn dropped the D20 and the D4, or so I've been told, because their sizes skewed the averages too much. But at the time, it really felt like the company was wanting to use D&D dice without using D&D rules. And honestly, I think this hurt them. I think this unnecessary complexity in an otherwise D&D style game scared away players, because the other mechanics were very D&D-like, as was the fantasy setting. For example, Shadowrun is a skill-based system. You build your character to have, shall we say, a certain set of skills. But both D&D and Earthdawn used character classes. In D&D, you were a fighter, a cleric, a thief, a monk, etc. In Earthdawn, you were a beastmaster, a troubadour, an illusionist, or an archer, etc. Just like in D&D, these disciplines, as opposed to classes, because again, things had to be different, set out what your character could possibly learn or do, and you just got better at those things as you advanced your character. Again, I think these almost D&D rules made it too similar and too different at the same time. It could have just been a different AD&D setting with the different terms being used to avoid the necessity of a license. It could have been a fantasy setting using the Shadowrun mechanics, which honestly most people who bought it when it first came out seemed to expect. It's a pity, because I loved the Earthdawn setting. The fantasy world was one in which cosmic horrific creatures had scoured the earth, and people who bunkered down in caves, which were underground cities while the creatures destroyed everything above ground, survived. The setting begins with people emerging from the caves, exploring, and making sure the world is safe once again before alerting others to join them. There's opportunity for adventure as the characters face leftover horrors and their spawn. There's diplomacy and politics as the different survivors disagree on how to run the new society that is awakening. It's a rich fantasy setting that is highly underrated and overlooked. It was a spiritual sequel, like I say, in that both settings were in a world that had just experienced a massive world-changing magical event. And it was a literal prequel in that Earthdawn was supposed to be set in the fantasy-rich history of the Shadowrun world. The two properties have since been severed because Shadowrun was sold off in 2001. Currently, Topps holds the rights to Shadowrun, which they licensed to Catalyst Game Labs. They acquired this mostly by accident when they bought WizKids in 2003, who had bought the rights from Thassa Corporation in 2001 when the company sort of went out of business. Earthdawn instead was licensed to WizKids when Thassa ceased publications in 2001, but Thassa did keep the ownership, and it appears to now be their flagship property since announcing their return as Thassa Games at Gen Con 2012. Do you have any examples of games whose rules feel like they should be different? Maybe a board game that uses cards that really should have dice, or a card game that could really use a board. Let me know in the comments. Give me ideas to, keep this series going.